again to everybody, and great to have you back as we gather once more for a final nice panel of the Climate Security Association Canada's conference. This time, panel 6, The Future of Operations, brings once more together very interesting, very educated, very knowledgeable people from both practice and scholarship, and I'm glad that you're joining us today. And I will briefly mention my panelists of our panel, and then I'll introduce them properly before I turn it over to their individual talks. So we have Diego Osorio and Engy Said joining us. We have Jessica Olcott Yllemo. We have Sara, Rabie. We have Andrew Heffernan, Michael Hosken, and Sharon O'Sullivan sharing their insights today. And as their talk is a hybrid format, we decided to go with their talk first. That's a slight deviation from the program, as you will notice. So first, we will start with the talks of Diego Osorio and Engy Said. Diego Osorio is a Canadian governmental official, an adjunct professor, and a PhD candidate at Utrecht University. He is a fellow at the Center of FrancoPaix at UQAM. He is NSA, former fellow at Harvard's Weatherhead Center. He has taught at the National Defense University, and he works at the intersection of climate change, security, governance, and peace building. Diego was involved in the genesis of the NATO Climate Security Center of Excellence and played a pivotal role in launching the CIAR's Climate Security Initiative. He also served as a senior expert on climate and conflict for the 2021 UN Food Systems Summit on Track 5 on resilience, and as a member of the Global Scientific Group for the World Food Programme. He joins this initiative in a personal academic capacity, I should add. Engy Said is an adjunct faculty and a PhD candidate at George Mason University. She was a visiting and teaching fellow at Harvard University. Engy's research focuses on the political economy of conflict and the intersectionality of economic and political power, particularly in the MENA region. Engy holds a Master of Arts in International Peace and Conflict Resolution from the University of Notre Dame. She has more than 16 years of experience in government affairs with a focus on the MENA region as well as Europe and the Mediterranean. She also has experience working on environment, climate change, and sustainable development. And Engy also asked me to add that she can be reached at esaid@gmu.edu. You can also find that online. With that, I would like to turn it over to Diego and Engy for your talk. You'll have these kind reminders. Please go for it.
Thank you very much. Is one disclaimer. I thought so it's important to establish that I'm doing this in my personal capacity, and in no way I'm referring to anything that concerns the government of Canada. I would just like to have my colleague Engy Said to start with the presentation in terms of the work we have done with these conferences. Engy, over to you.
Thank you, Diego. Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. The intersection of climate, peace, and development has emerged as a critical area of focus in international policy and diplomacy. Over recent years, key global forums, particularly the United Nations Climate Change Conference of the Parties, COP, and related multilateral processes have sought to address how climate change and environmental degradation contribute to conflict and instability. At the same time, there is a growing recognition that peace-building efforts must integrate climate resilience and adaptation to ensure long-term stability in vulnerable regions. This presentation reflects a multi-year collaboration focused on the evolving relationship between climate change and peace-building across the COP processes. From COP26 in Glasgow to the upcoming COP30 in Belém, our work has sought to understand how global governance has responded to the complex interlinkages between climate action and peace efforts in fragile and conflict-affected countries. Today's presentation builds directly on two high-level convenings that played a pivotal role in structuring this work. The first one is a virtual high-level panel titled COP28 and Beyond, Climate Relief and Recovery Paths to Peace, co-hosted by Diego and myself at the Salata Institute and the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University last year. The second event is a high-level panel recently convened at George Mason University's Carter School Peace Week in 2025, titled COP29, From Resolutions to Action, Operationalizing Climate Relief and Recovery. Discussions in these panels centered on the link between climate change and instability, the role of climate finance, particularly in fragile and conflict-affected countries, institutions and partnerships, youth engagement and social cohesion, food security, technology, and data for evidence-based policies. These discussions help shape a broader inquiry into whether climate peace-building governance should remain informal and networked, or whether we are now at a point where more focused, institutionalized mechanisms are needed to ensure coherence and effectiveness. Our aim is to explore how the climate conflict peace-building nexus is framed, how related international resolutions and commitments can be operationalized, and what pathways can support better alignment among institutions, data systems, and governance mandates. Both events that we held included leading policymakers and conflict experts, with the objective of bridging the gap between academic research and practical policy in the evolving field of climate and peace building. The discussions and findings from these panels serve as the foundation for the work we present here today, and the presentations highlight the key developments and themes discussed and draws comparisons to identify the challenges, opportunities, and developments in relation to international commitments related to climate change and peace building. I now turn to my colleague Diego to present the main findings and the framework.
Thank you, Engy. Well, basically, we were able to look at the input from all these experts and to analyze as well some of the trends that are happening in the governance development within the different COPs. And we have identified from the mapping 3 key different trends that relate to the trends that we present there. One is a shift from framing climate as a threat multiplier to a peace-building opportunity. That's certainly something that's emerging. Second is the convergence of informal networks into a more structured multi-actor coalition. It's important to remember this is an informal network onto a coalition. We're not necessarily building a new institution yet. The third element is the growing interest in embedding anticipatory action and resilience within climate instruments. We see this kind of merging of informal and formal, and is that a reason and a space for flexibility, or is that a lack or a space for new institutional construction? That's one thing we were wondering. In terms of the thematic trends, we were able to spot the following, and you can see them in the map. Obviously, and the mapping here, we're not going to go through each one of them, but it does refer to the fact that from COP26, we were from the awareness and a bit of reluctance to a point in which in COP29, we had integration and we had an engagement between what we call the triangle of multilaterals, international banking, security actors, and state actors. And it's an important element there because we see that the agenda is becoming streamlined, is normalized, and is very, very much claiming a real space within the work. These 3 shifts on what happens between COP28 relate to how we saw the whole angle here. Allow me to present, in terms of the milestones, from 2021, we see the work risk and fragility, and that's how we frame in the whole angle. And we're moving on to something in which that risk and fragility is transforming into a vector for finance in FCD, finance in fragility, climate and violence countries. The World Bank in the latest report has changed the way it's framing this engagement and how it's quantified. So basically, is this system, is this framing of the question giving us enough space to figure out where to put money, for what purpose, and how? That's key element there. The discussions, especially after the feedback from the different speakers that we interacted with, show the following implementation challenges. Engy?
Thank you, Diego. So despite the developments that Diego just mentioned, operationalizing the international commitments remain a major challenge from different viewpoints. The common themes that emerged from the panels that we hosted were, first, one of the biggest roadblocks is institutional fragmentation. Climate action and peace building often function in silos. For example, UN bodies like the UNFCCC UNDP, and UNHCR. They all work on different parts of the climate peace puzzle, but without a coordinated strategy, efforts are often duplicated or at some points missed entirely. Less than 12% of the humanitarian aid actually integrates climate adaptation, and most governments in fragile and conflict-affected countries lack the capacity to implement climate-smart or conflict-sensitive projects. The second challenge is that there is a clear lack of political will and governance capacity. Climate peace issues are often sidelined in formal UN negotiations, left to non-binding action agendas. Fragile states, which are most vulnerable to this phenomena, often lack the political stability or resources to carry out integrated approaches. And globally, short-term priorities like immediate security concerns tend to overshadow long-term climate resilience. The third challenge we face is financial barriers. Climate peace initiatives are constantly underfunded. Less than 2% of climate finance reaches small-scale conflict-affected regions. For example, the Loss and Damage Fund has raised only a fraction of what's actually needed. And even when funds exist, fragile states struggle to access them due to complicated accreditation processes. In addition, high-risk conflict zones further deter investments in the absence of de-risking mechanisms. Fourth, there are serious data monitoring challenges. The data we have is fragmented, with little integration between climate models and conflict analysis. And in many conflict-affected areas, reliable data is just not available, making it harder to create risk-informed adaptive programming. Finally, there are concerns around conflict sensitivity. Top-down climate initiatives, like large-scale renewable energy projects, for example, have sometimes displaced communities without consent and ignited tensions. Many programs lack safeguards or multi-year funding, leading to harmful unintended consequences. Again, I now give the floor to Diego to offer our framework and recommendations in light of these developments and challenges. Thank you.
Thank you. So basically, we see there's a space for further either informal, non-informal, or formal construction institutionally. And there's certain things that seem to emerge. One of them is there's a need to institutionalize a climate peace building mechanism on the global goal on adaptation. And this is certainly something that brings on a new framework, because we're basically now merging the wires of climate change security and climate change on finance. And this is certainly something that the time is ripe for it to happen. Second is that there should be an incorporation of conflict-sensitive metrics in climate finance streams, including the Loss and Damage Fund. The climate-related element is not something connected purely to what happens in terms of FCV's, Fragile Conflict Violence Framework. It needs to happen as well in how we validate the national contributions and all these elements. Third element is that there has to be regional observatories to detect and address the risk, and in that I chapeau to my colleagues from CGR. They have one excellent one, and we should multiply them. I have them in different places. Fourth element, we should continue working on the triangular coalitions, states, peace, security actors, and multilateral development banks. And that interface is something that for those who work on the humanitarian development work, you remember that there was a lot of talking about how exactly civil-military interaction connects with humanitarians and how the whole thing extends out to development. Well, this is the next frontier, if I can put it that way. So here we have those recommendations. The anticipatory data and infrastructure is a climate multiplier, but what happens inside the climate multiplier? Is that just a phrase, or is there something else for that? We have to strengthen those observatories, and the institutionalization of cross-sectoral diplomacy is essential. It's not purely a matter of foreign affairs. It has to be something that whole of government approaches need to integrate. We need to connect the entire systems to make sure that we are ready for that. And so, one last thing. Say we have a situation in which in Belen, things continue as they are. There might be a fragmented initiative and self-coordination. The recommendations, you see them there, might be a formal track under the GGA work program. That's a possibility. If we have a bit of a convergence, if the negotiation leads and takes on this particular element, is there space for an integration in UNFCCC, MDBs, and USP building? Is the climate security mechanism a mechanism purely for coordination, or should we just co-integrated with the special envoy, and on top of that, mandated within the framework of the P5s? There's a space for that. So there could be a task force on climate security governance and use of the COP30 to formalize the connection between, say, MDBs, both from the entire spectrum, World Bank as Shanghai frameworks, to the whole CCRP goals. Say there is a risk management and there is an anticipatory system, we could start working on an integrated data and developing a common picture of where the tipping points are. So let's just call it climate multiplier 2.0 in a more detailed way. Is that a space? And if there is a multilateral setback, well, pretty much fragmentation during geopolitical tensions, and we will go exactly into what we will be doing by default, which is informal coalitions, G7+, B20, regional areas, and the regional mechanisms, as well as an enhanced development on CSO, civil society organizations. And that we have to play as well in terms of geopolitics. Where is the most fertile ground for these kind of discussions at the moment? European Union, Asia, certainly maybe not south of the border here, but we need to figure out exactly where is the space to carry on with this agenda. And we just complete now by saying the road from COP26 to COP30 illustrates an essential transformation. When we got started with the CGR climate security, it was a threat. It was something you wouldn't do. It's something that you wouldn't mention, mixing food systems, scientists, and soldiers and security. We're way past that. We now have to figure out a way to work together on that element. The second is, we continue developing, if we carry on in the framework of security, we continue developing metrics, analysis, and a definition of the problem on risk. And that's essential, but the risk is quantifiable. Risk is the way of connecting security with finance. And the how that risk is being quantified at the elements of FCVs, it has to be translated in terms of who is putting what money where. And if we say, for instance, and the World Bank is playing a key role on this, how to facilitate funding and investments in fragile areas, and now they have a mandate to do it, well, we still need to figure out how we connect the actuarial science with the accounting, the risking, and the framing that comes behind and within the climate multiplier, the threat multiplier. How exactly does that work? Because you cannot tell an actuarial is a threat multiplier, end of the story. We need to figure out exactly where the numbers are. Another final thing is, from the sectoral silos to multilateral partnerships, the funding is creating a situation that was happening before. Humans tend to work together for a certain motivation, and sometimes they tend to figure out silos. It's my experience working in this field that there has been a lot of silos. You have a piece of the data, you have a model, you have an analysis. I'm not necessarily going to share it with you because that means that I'm losing my own funding. This is coming on us. This is big. This is of a huge size. We need to break that. And the funding is certainly something that will facilitate it or will make it more difficult. Different institutions fight for this. We need to figure out having an integrated system. And one of the discussions at the Environmental Peace Building Association, I'm a co-chair of one of the groups there was the whole idea of creating a trust fund. Basically, the same pot of money for everybody, and let's all go and work with that pot of money. So that we don't necessarily have to fight for the money, we just concentrate on developing the science and the knowledge that is needed. Final conclusion, we have to set the stage for peace-positive climate governance at the COP30 and beyond. Not because it's an addition to the climate security, because that's at the core of what we need to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diego and Engy, for your presentations. Now we turn it over to Jessica Olcott Yllemo. Jessica is a research scientist at the Center for Naval Analyses and an executive committee member at the Global Military Advisory Council on Climate Change. She has more than 18 years of experience working at the nexus of complex international issues. Her research focuses on climate and energy security, emergency response, disaster preparedness, security cooperation, and civil affairs. Ms. Yllemo previously served as a US Fulbright Public Policy Fellow in Kosovo, as well as the Director of Climate Security Programs at the American Security Project, and also regularly publishes on climate and energy issues. Jessica, over to you.
Thank you. I'm here to kick the hornet's nest of AI. I do need to start with the obligatory disclaimer that although I'm here under the auspices of GMAC and I am a research scientist and specialized generalist at CNA, Anything I present here is my own individual viewpoint and should not be viewed as an endorsement of any kind of position or policy or program. And also at the end, I'm going to mention some technologies that are out there. I'm not receiving any sort of benefit whatsoever. I'm just a general researcher who is trying to spread the gospel of AI. So we don't have a ton of time, and there are a lot of different aspects of AI. So I'm going to try to keep this at the 30,000-foot level and synthesize a couple of different research projects that I'm working on. Essentially, AI is just the ability of computing and computers to do functions or analysis that typically humans would do. There's a couple of different types. Most of the things I'm going to be talking about are generative AI, so things like ChatGPT. I'm not going to get into all these things or bore you with like GPU calculations or terawatt hours. I'm just going to try to keep it broad in the hopes that everyone here can really think about AI's impact on their work or their research and or how to leverage it. There's a lot of really, really great things already happening with AI. Individual companies like the Bezos Earth Fund or the Barca Fund, NVIDIA, they have all kinds of programs that are doing really incredible things for climate research. There are enhancements of early warning systems. You can quickly assess imagery to inform biodiversity situations and conservation violations. There's a whole synthesis of data on global fishing and sea level rise that's really important. It can also really help understand maintenance and supply chains in a way that we really haven't been able to do before. A short example of that is power lines in the US. Usually that has to be done line of sight, so you need to send somebody out, examine what's going on, then they have to do the maintenance. There's an ability now for power companies to actually predict and analyze when the maintenance needs to be done. So it's a good news story there. There's also the flip side, right? Because all of these things require data in some way, shape, or form. So you require a data center. And I'm sure that most of you have heard about data centers and how information from satellites and sensors need to be fed through data centers. These are sometimes called water vampires because they require so much water to cool. Depending on where you are, depends on how that's done. It could be coal energy usage. It could be natural gas. There's a big push for that. The International Energy Agency just released a great report kind of highlighting those details. But the most important point for us as climate practitioners and those studying AI and energy and climate is that most frequently the data centers are located in places that are already dealing with water stress and water scarcity, so they exacerbate those issues already. Large language models require millions of liters of water for cooling, and it has to be fresh water. It can't be salt water because the salt water will corrode the infrastructure. They require huge energy capacity to operate. So that obviously has implications for emissions. If you go to Google, usually when you Google something, there's now automatically a little AI-generated summary at the top. To do that requires 10 times the cost of a standard Google search. And the way that this has come online so quickly has really caught energy off guard. There just is an insatiable demand for energy and for these data centers. There's also, Andrew will talk about this, so I don't want to steal his thunder here, but AI is also enabling the rapid spread of mis and disinformation. And I'm sure he's going to talk more to that. And overall in the industry, there's a lack of transparency just about how much energy, how much water, and what the implications are of that. So a couple of the three big players, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, have released some figures in terms of their data centers. Microsoft has said outright that about 42% of its facilities are in high water stress areas, so just under half. Google puts theirs closer to 15, so there's also some environmental justice concerns there. But in general, there's a lack of transparency. Amazon doesn't produce any data about that. So there's a lot of pressure being put on energy grids worldwide. Microsoft, Google, and Amazon have also pledged to be water positive by 2030, but I'm not really sure what that means, so more to follow there. More on data center demand. There's obviously an explosion for it. Every industry everywhere is going to be required in some way to use this, I think forced either by the markets or by nature of the business to do that. So I don't think we'll be replaced by AI. I don't think robots are coming for us. But I do think those who understand how to use AI to achieve their end states will come out ahead. The International Energy Agency estimates that energy use from AI data centers will double in the next 2 years. to more than 200%, something like more than 1,000 terawatts. So that's just incredible to think about. That will consume as much energy as countries do annually at a national level. So the entire country of Japan, for example. The Economist and The Guardian have both had some great reporting about this recently. In the most recent edition of The Economist, it pointed out Ireland and their current issues with it. About a fifth of all electricity in Ireland is used on data centers. So that's something like 20 to 25% of their electricity. That's a big amount. So more to follow there. But there are huge implications, obviously, for climate, energy, and water. You also see some companies now, given the state of the global discourse around climate and energy, you see them pushing out their decarbonization goals, partially because of this, because of the emissions that's going to come out of this data center demand. Most relevant for the people in this room and online is probably the implications for water and energy. The largest concentration of data centers is in Data Center Alley, near where I live, just outside of Washington, D.C. There's a couple different reasons for that, but that's the largest concentration. Water usage went up by 2/3 between 2019 and 2023. There is some silver lining there in that, some of the centers are using recycled wastewater programs, and Amazon has in the 40s range of water replenishment programs, but the data and the actual follow-through on that is still sort of yet to be seen. You do see in Oregon that there was an instance where a Google-owned data center was using up to 1/3 of the city's water supply for cooling. So especially those in the Colorado River Basin, if there are any data centers there, that's a huge issue. There are purchase power agreements, so they're trying to get around the energy demand and trying to create some agreement, but there's a new geopolitics emerging there between private companies, governments, and where they're actually going to put these things, because they do require a lot of land, and they do require a certain type of water. So there's a whole host of them coming online, but you're seeing these just sort of explode everywhere, which has second and third order effects for what we do and how we operate as a practitioner community. Just for certain data points, it's really astonishing to look at this. This is not a typo. The U.S. is home to more than 5,000 of the world's data centers, the most of which are in Northern Virginia, followed closely-ish by Germany and Great Britain, with have somewhere around 500. China has about 450. Those are usually using coal, so not great there. They have a program, I'm sure everyone's heard of Belt and Road, but maybe you haven't heard of Eastern Data, Western Computing. So they're trying to build up their infrastructure. Canada, obviously, up there in the ranks with about 300 data centers. So expect those numbers to increase. But you're also seeing the inverse. So you're seeing moratoriums happen on data centers in countries like Singapore and the Netherlands. So they say, no, we're just not going to do this. But you're also seeing sovereign AI. So that's when an individual country will host its own data center. So they'll strike an agreement with Microsoft or Amazon or whatever, or they'll build their own. So a particularly interesting case here is Telenor in Norway, which is a major multinational communications company. They went from idea to deployment in just under a year. So again, the speed and scale of these things is just terrifying, quite frankly. But what they're going to do, or what is in the plan there, is to build the sovereign data center, right? So they will have control, ostensibly, right, over what's coming in and out of the data center. But their plan is to use the excess heat that comes out of the data center to heat residential buildings that are nearby. So it's sort of a good news. It's not all bad, it's not all good. It's like, if there's a way to thread this needle, I think, but we really need to be conscious about it. I do want to mention the responsible AI movement. And again, I'm just trying to arm you with sort of the wave tops of what's happening in this conversation. It seems like there is a new conference every week, right, on responsible AI. Almost every major institution or business has some sort of outlined responsible AI. There's a big effort to try to come together as an international community to set certain standards. The EU came out front, no surprise there, with the AI Act. It's the first legal framework about AI, and that's trying to set some parameters about how AI is going to be adopted and used. So it creates different tiers of risk for AI. So some risks, if it's lower risk, they're more permissible environments, but you can sort of go into those weeds if you want to. It has all kinds of different components. In the US, There is an office within the Department of Defense called the CDAO, the Chief Digital and AI Office, that is working on responsible AI. So for all the sort of, when we think about warfare, they're working on not just precision fires, so you actually hit the things that you want to hit, but they're looking at how to leverage AI, not just for weapons or targeting, but also how to reduce civilian harm, which I think is really important and don't want to get lost in the conversation. The sub-bullets there, responsible, equitable, traceable, reliable, governable, those are the ones that CDAO in the US use. All of the other ones, so Microsoft's, IBM's, Amazon's, there's some sort of version of that. So the nuances are there, but like it's generally those that are out there. And then forthcoming, early June, I believe, will be the Hamburg Declaration on Responsible AI for the Sustainable Development Goals. So like I said, there's just an incredible amount happening in this space. I don't have much time left. I had hoped to play a video for you because on the bright side of this, there's some really, really great and exciting things happening for responders. I'm particularly interested in my research on civil military affairs, and there's a lot of really, really great technologies coming online that are already leveraging AI to do that computing that usually would take hours or days. So in a military context, something like a battle damage assessment or an estimate of casualties or something like that. This is on the civilian side, particularly, these are all hyperlinked. I am happy to share these slides. Again, I'm not getting anything from any of these companies. I'm just genuinely really excited to see where this goes. The one in particular that I want to flag is the Google FireSat. So they're sending satellites up in the air. It's providing all kinds of cover, as well as fire aid. That, I believe, is a World Economic Forum pilot project that was done in Turkey, where they had about an 85% accuracy for predicting when and how a wildfire would break out, which is really great if they can take that to scale. So some of the stuff is still coming. I know there's a lot of concern, very justifiably, with a lot of the key data sources from the US that have been sponsored by the US that are coming offline. So this is to give you a little ray of hope. The other one I want to point out here is Climate Trace. That is the one that's been backed by Al Gore. That is providing real-time greenhouse gas emissions accounting. So if you're interested in that, that is definitely something to look at. Last one, but there's a lot of exciting things. These are meant to be illustrative, not exhaustive. So I'm happy to answer any questions, but that's all I got.
Thank you very much, Jessica. So fascinating, and I'm sure we will have many interesting questions in the Q&A afterwards. Before we come to that, we move on with Sara Rabie. Sara is a climate, peace and security specialist for the Alliance of Bioversity International and CIAT, specializing in linking policy and science on the interlinkages between climate change, peace building, gender and migration in fragile contexts. Prior to her current position, Sara led the implementation of the COP27 presidency initiative, Climate Responses for Sustaining Peace, short CRSP, as the Program Officer on Climate Security and Development at the Cairo International Center for Conflict Resolution, Peacekeeping and Peacebuilding. Sara's current research profile particularly focuses on the future of peacekeeping and climate change, gender-informed climate security and climate migration routes between Africa and the European Union. She holds a Master of Science degree from the University of Glasgow in International Relations. Sara, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I promise to make this as short and sweet and not depressing as possible. Very difficult given the context of peacekeeping, but let's try. So my presentation is going to focus on the future of peacekeeping, the United Nations peacekeeping missions in Africa particularly, and where, how, and whether we can position climate, peace and security, or the climate security agenda within the new format of peacekeeping missions in Africa. So just a very quick introduction. This presentation is going to focus on, like I said, more of a descriptive analysis of how the UN peacekeeping missions are going to look like in Africa, given the changes that are currently taking place within the United Nations Security Council mandates on peacekeeping, as well as the operational implementation, the size and the funding of the UN peacekeeping missions in Africa, and also present a literature review on the positioning of climate, peace and security, or the climate security agenda thus far in the UN peacekeeping missions, and whether that is sustainable or going to be continued in the future with the new missions or not. not only within the UN security mandates on peacekeeping, but also the broader frameworks on peace and security, the new Agenda for Peace that was launched last year by Antonio Guterres. There's also the Summit for the Future and the Pact for the Future that was a product of the summit, and whether or not it included climate security. Spoiler alert, it did not. And there's also the Berlin Ministerial on Peacekeeping that is happening today in Berlin, where the countries are going to announce their new commitments towards peacekeeping, and whether or not climate security is included. Also, spoiler alert, it is not. Not even on the agenda, no, seriously. And then lastly, we're going to be providing a policy and operational recommendations for how we can address this as researchers or as practitioners working on climate security. How can we kind of not shape-shift, but accommodate these changes to make sure that this conversation still takes place within the peacekeeping spaces. So I don't want to go through why climate change is a threat multiplier. We're here because it is a threat multiplier, I guess. But the one thing that I do want to note is that the 10 most climate vulnerable countries worldwide include 7 in Africa. And these 7 have had or currently have peacekeeping missions. We're talking about Central Africa, South Sudan, Somalia, Mali. These are all countries that were ranked some of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, but also some of the most conflict or fragility affected countries in Africa and in the world. So this kind of played, it was a double-edged sword, or it created a very complex situation where these countries were not able to have holistic, sustainable responses to sustain peace or to build positive peace, but also at the same time, because of the conflicts, they've had a very difficult time adapting to climate change. So it kind of had this two-way street situation where climate adaptation is being hindered by conflict, and conflict was exacerbated by climate change, and this kind of created this vicious cycle. So what are the evolving dynamics of peacekeeping missions, and why are we saying it's an evolving dynamic? Some harsh critics would say that peacekeeping is collapsing, but we're in Canada and people here are nice, so we need to be nice and say that it's an evolving dynamic. It's evolving because there is a very core shift in the essence of peacekeeping missions. And I would like to say that peacekeeping missions are more of a living organism because they've shifted and they've adapted since decades ago multiple times. But why are we panicking now? Because this shift is not only related to the funding or the size of the missions, but it's on why do we need peacekeeping and should we have peacekeeping? So these existential questions were never really brought to the forefront with the intensity that it is now. It was mostly how should we make peacekeeping work, but now we're talking about should we try with peacekeeping as much as we do. So this is why we're having this existential crisis. But more descriptively, the UN peacekeeping missions have had proactive and reactive factors that led to more donor fatigue. So it's very expensive to sustain a peacekeeping mission. It costs around $1 billion a year to sustain a peacekeeping mission, a large, long-term peacekeeping mission. There's a geopolitical gridlock, and we're going to talk about that extensively in a bit, but I think some of the speakers from yesterday also touched up on the idea that countries like Russia or China might have a different positioning on peacekeeping than the liberal Western democratic design of peacekeeping that evolved post-Cold War, where we want to build a democratic nation, we want to build a liberal democracy in fragile and conflict-affected countries in Africa, for example. Other countries have said this is not realistic and we're not doing that. And some countries completely refrained from this entire modality, like Russia and China, and they have their own outlook on how peacekeeping should look. Host countries' resistance is also an important factor. Mali, for example, is one of the most recent countries that have very urgently asked peacekeeping missions to step out. And one of the core mission, or one of the core pillars of peacekeeping missions, aside from non-interference, is host state consent. So a lot of host states are currently refusing the idea of hosting peacekeeping missions. and also the changing conflict environments or asymmetrical conflicts. And also Mali is an example where conflict is not interstate and conflict is not between different tribes. Conflict is with, for example, a terrorist organization or terrorist groups. And this guerrilla warfare is where UN peacekeeping missions have kind of sat very awkwardly, where they are not mandated with counterterrorism. But then again, what's happening in the country is considered terrorism. So the UN peacekeeping missions are there, but cannot engage, because also one of the main pillars of peacekeeping is that it's not offensive. They can only defend, and very, very, very seldom the peacekeeping missions launch an attack, and that does not happen. It's outside of their mandate. Picking battles, every pun intended, between liberal peace building and political reality. And this kind of goes back to the idea where the UN Security Council is kind of picking its battles. There are certain countries or certain contexts where the UN peacekeeping missions have addressed the fact that the situation is beyond the capacities of what we envisage a peacekeeping mission should do. A very realistic example of this was, for example, Congo, where the UN missions have realized that perhaps we've kind of overpromised. We cannot do as much as we thought we could do. We cannot focus on protection of civilians, state building, overseeing democratic elections, fostering dialogue. We cannot do all of this. We can perhaps reach a point within the conflict and peace spectrum where there is a state of stabilization that is effective enough for the nation to build itself and kind of leave it to its own devices to see how it can build itself in a way that, just do your own thing. We've kind of held your hand to this point and there is no active warfare, and then good luck with everything else. And we cannot promise to oversee the government, building the government and state building and democratization and all of that. We can't do that. An example of that was like I said, Congo. An example of that was Central Africa, for example, as well. Missions that already exited a long time ago was the Côte d'Ivoire. They've also kind of reached that realization as the Security Council. But also, the main shifts included, more specifically, a willingness to engage in counterterrorism. This is not explicit. They never said we're going to engage in counterterrorism, but they've kind of made it a bit more acceptable. And they've very specifically started outlining how they're going to exit the mission, the host countries. And this has never happened before. With the renewed resolutions for example, MONUSCO and the transition mission in Somalia, they've had a plan to exit, and this has not happened before. Why should we care as the climate, peace and security, or the climate security community? Is because where do we sit now with the new peacekeeping missions? They're short-term, they're on a one-year renewal basis, they're a lot less funded, and they're very specific. So we're entering a country, we're agreeing with this host country to go to that country to, for example, oversee democratic government, or to protect civilians, or to do a very specific time-bound mandates. So how are we going to integrate climate security? One of the main things why this pragmatization of the UN peacekeeping UN peacekeeping missions was criticized is because this kind of goes against everything that the UN has been saying for a while. They've been promoting the importance of climate security and promoting the importance of this agenda. They've created the climate security mechanism, a very well-funded mechanism of the DPO, the DPA, the UNDP, and UNEP. And now they're going back saying, well, maybe we need to cut this one out. And this has also happened with the WPS agenda, with the Women, Peace and Security agenda, a much better established agenda than the peacekeeping missions. I'm going to skip the UNMES example because I think Dr. Johnson has thoroughly touched up on that yesterday. But then I'm going to talk about the opportunities for the climate, peace and security environment, agenda, whatever. What we could do is that we can use a Trojan horse called multilateralism. And this is basically an entry point. There are the literature has covered several entry points for climate security. But the main core, or one of the main basic principles of peacekeeping, is multilateralism and maintaining multilateralism. And several ministerials and meetings on peacekeeping have kind of enshrined the concept of multilateralism as a core of peacekeeping. But then climate security implementation, climate security projects have portrayed excellent multilateral cooperations between different factors and between different actors. So this could be one of the main, very interesting entry points. Climate security for example, whether on early warnings or joint risk analysis or cross-border resilience efforts, presents really realistic and doable entry points for the peacekeeping missions to continue preserving their multilateral dynamics. This dual effect is basically something that was presented in the literature as well, which is that, as Dr. Johnson has discussed yesterday, there are several examples where the UN peacekeeping missions could not reach a certain community because of the droughts or because of certain climate change manifestations. But then again, there are different humanitarian agencies that can work around that in a way, or the UNIP can work around that in a way. Combining humanitarian agents like the IOM, the WFP, or etc., with the peacekeeping missions could present a very excellent entry point for multilateral action and to sustain that climate change stays on the agenda and on the mandates of UN peacekeeping missions. Final words. To wrap this up very quickly, how can climate security stay on the agenda of peacekeeping missions? It needs to act now and here, not in a very long-term mandate, not within a very long-term timeline. We need climate security to kind of adapt itself to more short-term, realistic, doable interventions that the peacekeeping missions could adopt and could digest more easy. It's not easy, but it's more doable. Something to go back on UNMISS and the case study of UNMISS is that this was something that UNMISS has adopted, which is that they made climate security work for the mandate. They did not expand the mandate. So this was something that made UNMISS a very realistic or a very successful integration in comparison to other missions. As to why climate security worked, it's because they made the climate security agenda work for them, and they did not recreate what was called in the literature like a Christmas tree of a mandate, where you just put different ornaments and expand it to include everyone, where realistically we cannot do that, we don't know how to do that, and we cannot afford to do that. So basically, like I said, make climate security work in the here and now. Moving on from greening the blue, because as we know, the contributing missions don't always know how to green the blues, they cannot afford it, and we cannot ask, for example, Canada, as well as China, as well as Sudan, or any other contributing country to green their blues in the same way. That's simply proven to be not effective. And yeah, honestly, to wrap it up very quickly, is that climate responses must, in a way, aim to help peacekeepers do their jobs. So I think someone yesterday said that the army has a job. To wrap it up very quickly, peacekeepers have a job. And it must, in a way, be aware, climate security has to be aware of that and make its agenda work for the peacekeepers and to help them do their job. Other than that, then we are probably looking at an expiring discussion on climate security in peacekeeping missions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sara. Thank you very much. That was exactly 15 minutes. Brilliant timekeeping and also super fascinating. Next talk will be by Andrew Heffernan. Andrew holds a PhD in political science from the University of Ottawa, where he's a part-time professor specializing in international relations and comparative politics. He's also climate associate at the Information Integrity Lab and a regular contributor to the Center for International Governance Innovation. Andrew's major research interests include climate disinformation, African politics, global environmental governance, community-based conservation, and the politics of food. Please, over to you.
Thank you very much. One of the benefits of going this late in the conference is that a lot of sort of the foregrounding for my paper has been said, so I will try to keep things fairly straightforward and as brief as I can in discussing a topic as complex as climate disinformation, and maybe even sprinkling in some discussion on AI, as has been mentioned. So I kind of have a few contentions to make, and I think they should be pretty simple in a room like this. Climate change is a threat multiplier, or some version of that, as many people have said, and is basically exacerbating every other existing security challenge, plus just a lot of other challenges that already existed. One thing that I do contend is that I think increasingly we actually do have the tools to limit global warming to 1.5 maybe or 2 degrees Celsius. We've been developing a lot of innovation. There's better policies that we've developed and some of which have been in place. But something that I've been thinking about specifically over the past couple of years as I've been shifting my focus from kind of climate policy specifically to climate disinformation is that increasingly the major limiting factor stopping us from implementing these kinds of things, these tools that do exist, is disinformation and getting enough political buy-in from societies around the world to enact these types of tools. And certainly we've seen that here in Canada, but around the world as well. And one of the contentions that I will get into as I disaggregate some of the topics of disinformation a little bit more, and actually what my key argument was in an op-ed I had published yesterday in the Canada's National Observer, is that we should consider all misinformation, malinformation, incorrect information as it relates to climate change specifically as disinformation. And again, we'll talk a little bit about more why that is. And then get into some of what we can do about it, some of the bigger problems about climate disinformation that go beyond climate change and security itself, and then kind of get into some of the things that we can do about preventing that. So why do I think that all climate change, all incorrect information about climate change should be considered disinformation? So if we start, misinformation is usually inaccurate information that is spread without necessarily having the intent to deceive, whereas disinformation, it does have that intent to deceive. So the difference might be a fossil fuel company funding some kind of bot on Twitter, propagating incorrect information about climate change, and there is intent to deceive because basically they don't want people to believe in climate change, or they don't want people to believe that effective policies are effective because they want us to keep burning fossil fuels. Now, it could be then misinformation if some of these lies or incorrect information are respread by our crazy uncle on Facebook or Twitter or wherever else, not necessarily intending to deceive their friends and followers and family, but nonetheless resulting in that. There's also malinformation, which we think about or talk about a little bit less. But this we see very often, and we saw a lot in the recent election, in most elections, which is actually information that tends to be on sort of accurate premises or accurate information that is sort of presented in a context that makes it actually inaccurate. Now, why do I think all of it should be considered disinformation or is best understood as disinformation? It's partly because I would argue that all climate change, all incorrect climate change information stems from a place that is deliberate, targeted, coordinated, and very well funded, which we see a little bit here in this slide, as well as some of the next. There's a lot of mis and disinformation out there that exists, but with what really differentiates climate disinformation is, in one simple word, is profit. There are, there's limitless websites that promote sometimes somewhat convincing arguments about things like the fact that the world is flat. I've read into some of this because one of my colleagues does some really interesting research on conspiracy theories, and I'm surprised about how well some of this stuff is actually thought out. But there's a big difference between those who propagate things about the world being flat for some reason or other. And as I've already alluded to with climate disinformation, there's usually a very clear profit motive linked to this. And whether that's petrostates, which some of you have alluded to over the past couple days, or fossil fuel companies or others, there is obviously a great deal of profit to be made out there from all of us continuing to burn fossil fuels. However, beyond that, and what makes dealing with climate disinformation very specific and very important, is that there are a great number of actors who are engaged in climate disinformation to really prevent combating climate change for that profit motive. And that, I think, is a problem. Everybody in this room, again, is, I think, in agreement that more climate change means less security, more problems. So we do want to encourage the fight against climate change. But beyond that, there are a great deal of nefarious actors who engage in climate change disinformation specifically, not even necessarily for a profit motive or to push back against the fight against climate change, but instead simply to sow divide and contribute to democratic deterioration, which we've been seeing, unfortunately, around the world, and we've been experiencing these kinds of things in our politics more close to home. Why is this the case with climate disinformation specifically? I would argue that climate disinformation is exceptional in a few senses. Climate change is kind of this polarizing issue across a long time horizon. We have been thinking about climate change in an increasingly polarized manner, I would say, over the past 2 to 3 decades, and we are going to continue dealing with climate change. COVID, sort of, I've had a couple conversations that would suggest otherwise, but COVID kind of came and went to some degree. Vaccines kind of came and went again. They didn't really go away because there's still a lot of these issues that we're talking about, including polarization. But climate change is kind of the polarizing issue that is out there that can be effectively polarized, weaponized, and leveraged to simply sow divide. So there are all these actors that have a great deal of profit to be made by contributing to climate disinformation online. And then there are a whole bunch of other actors, often nefarious, that can purchase and harvest our information that we are inputting into our smartphones and devices all the time, so that they can know specifically what kind of targeted messaging they can use to effectively deliver climate disinformation towards us. And this is partly where AI comes in, as no longer is climate disinformation simply about climate denialism. Is climate change real or not, or is it human caused or not? But increasingly, knowing the kinds of things that we think about, knowing the kinds of things that we click on or linger on our smartphones is easily accessible. All of these social media companies, as we've seen, as they cozy up to Donald Trump, are out for their own profit margins again, and are incentivized to sell our data to third and eventually fourth party users who can, again, do nefarious things with it, such as selling it to organizations out there that can use the tools of AI to have increasingly targeted messages to address these issues in different ways. So again, some people might be more susceptible to messages of climate change is completely a hoax, as opposed to perhaps people that are certain to believe in the science of climate change, but they might be targeted with information that calls into question the utility of a carbon tax, for instance, or whether driving an EV is actually beneficial to the environment. So these kinds of more gray area arguments that AI can be used to leverage to use much more to kind of complexify and evolve the tactics of disinformation, and as a result kind of devolve the health of our information ecosystem. Again, this is particularly problematic because not only is that limiting our ability to fight climate change and then contributing to lack of security in so many instances, as we've heard about the past couple days, but it is really serving to fundamentally undermine our social fabric and our democracies, which we have been seeing kind of around the world. It's become fairly commonplace to hear about the increasing polarization across society, and this has really been happening around the world, and disinformation is certainly contributing to that and something that we need to be concerned about as a result. This is kind of a lot of the stuff that we've covered in the past couple days, so I'll sort of gloss over that and move by and start thinking about what we can really do about this. I see disinformation in general as a bit of a supply and a demand issue. We've already kind of covered the motives for those that are providing the supply out there. Governing information is a particularly fraught endeavor to try to get into, and I say governing information almost facetiously in a sense, because it is certainly not something that we are able to do effectively and probably not something that we want to do. If we think that there is a problem with the information ecosystem out there, having the federal government come in and enact policies to dictate what is accurate information or not, or to try to fact check everything that is going on out there, or to black out certain social media platforms to prevent disinformation. All of this stuff is probably not possible and probably not very desirable because it risks further polarizing society. Those who want to believe in climate disinformation do not want to listen to the government. They probably don't want to listen to us in this room. So as a result, trying to limit that supply of disinformation is very difficult, probably impossible. We should think about these kinds of techniques and tools and policies and approaches for doing so. But more so, we have to think about that demand side and think about the health of our information ecosystem in general, and think about how we can contribute to all people within society having more demand for accurate, healthy information ecosystems that stem from certain types of places. And There's no simple way to go about this, but one thing that we have suggested at the Information Integrity Lab, and it was the title of a report that we released early in the year, I guess December or January, are whole of society approaches for tackling disinformation. No one government body or organization can dictate what is accurate versus inaccurate information, what is information versus malinformation versus misinformation versus disinformation. Instead, we have to think about the health of our ecosystem in general. And again, part of my argument about the exceptionalism of climate change disinformation is this is one really key issue that we can consider. And I argue if we can deal with climate change disinformation, we can start contributing to a lot of solutions for a number of these problems that exist out there. These are a few approaches that I suggest can contribute to that whole of society approach. We need to think about how we can deal with these kinds of things locally, nationally, and globally. We need to build a wealth of technical tools and assistance so that people can leverage tools, technology that exists to push back against the way that AI, for example, is increasingly targeting messaging towards different people. We do need regulatory measures and legal frameworks, so there is a place for government in this, but I think governments, experts, and expertise do have to come at these kinds of things with a place of humility, realizing that we can't fix all of this and that there are a lot of segments of the population that simply do not want to listen to the us equation in this. Again, realizing that we cannot effectively govern or blackout or limit the kinds of technological platforms, and I would say often problematic technology platforms out there. Think about how we can work with them. Think about how we can contribute to incentivizing healthy information ecosystems to push back against those massive incentives that do exist for disinformation and for climate disinformation very specifically. And within this, I think there's a really important place for education in general, but certainly journalism. I mean, this is, getting to a whole other set of questions, but the place of journalism and media, certainly in Canada, but across the world, is in question. I think it is under a number of crises, and I think that knowing the importance of journalism and media for the health of democracy is extremely important, and without that, I think there's a question of whether or not we can have a healthy social fabric and healthy functioning democracies in the era of climate change, which was a question that was raised by one of the earlier presentations. I think, again, that's something that I definitely don't have an answer for. What is the answer to the deteriorating media ecosystem in Canada and elsewhere? But those are the kinds of things that we have to think about in order to contribute to those whole of society approaches for contributing to a more positive and healthy information ecosystem in general, which can certainly help in the fight against climate change, but also deal with some of the broader security issues we are thinking about, health issues moving forward into, unfortunately, the next pandemic that will come, hopefully not for decades or more, but these are the kinds of things that we're thinking about at the Information Integrity Lab, and I will leave it for there today. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, Andrew. Thank you very much. And now we are turning it over to the last two speakers of today's panel. I'm thrilled to introduce Michael Hosken and Sharon O'Sullivan. Michael Hosken holds a Master of Science in Environmental Sustainability from the University of Ottawa and a graduate diploma in Disaster and Emergency Management from Royal Roads University. He is the Community Resilience Research Portfolio Manager at Defense Research and Development at Canada's Centre for Security Science, where his work focuses on strengthening whole-of-society approaches to disaster preparedness and recovery through science and technology. Michael also brings over a decade of experience bridging military service, public policy, and applied research in the fields of climate security and emergency management. He joins this panel, however, in a personal academic capacity. His views do not represent those of the Government of Canada. And then also Sharon O'Sullivan is joining us. She is a full professor at the Telfer School of Management at the University of Ottawa. Her research expertise is in the areas of cross-cultural management and training and development, with a focus on enhancing sustainable innovation competencies. Sharon is also certified as a Canadian human resource leader and as a cultural intelligence facilitator. Over to you again.
Thank you. So, Canadian Army personnel would not look at climate change and flooding as a hoax. because they've literally been knee-deep in it. And they also have had very grounded experience with having to grapple with different stakeholders, citizens, civil organizations, etc. So the question motivating this study, which was Mike's question, when he brought it to me, we worked together for his thesis, was how do we define exactly what their performance expectations should be to know, are they the best ones equipped to do this? How are they meeting these challenges? And stepping backwards, given those performance requirements, what are the competencies needed? How much of this is an overlap with what they already do in the military, and how much of this kind of civil flood responding is distinctive in terms of the capacities that are needed? So Mike is going to give you a little bit more about the background at a more detailed level, discuss a little bit of the literature review, the gaps that we saw, and what motivated us to go in more detail, the methodology we used to investigate it, and our findings. And then, time permitting, we're open to discussion about what we did. I think that's about it. I'll let you go. Yeah, there you go.
Great, thanks. So, yeah, exactly. Sharon did a great job introducing why I focus on the military. So, domestic flood events are trending upward, not downward. There's been a spike in requests for assistance. So provinces are leaning more and more on the Canadian Armed Forces as their own provincial or territorial capacity runs out. And so the CAF is no longer just the force of last resort. They are becoming often the first large organized workforce to arrive, especially in the cases of Indigenous communities requiring evacuations. So as far as the research gap goes, we still don't know which competencies make soldiers effective in flood roles, and without that evidence, staffing, training, and readiness plans are guesswork. So for the literature review, we used peer-reviewed academic literature as well as the published English language gray literature from military and government organizations to conduct the literature review. And we identified 4 main performance criteria. So that was identification and mitigation of hazards, which requires knowledge of risks and how to mitigate them. It also requires skills to perform those mitigation steps. Second was operation of specialized rescue equipment, which refers vaguely to technical knowledge. It does not clearly specify which equipment or role-specific expectations. And 3, we had intra and inter-team coordination and management. So communication was described as essential, but the literature really lacked any detail on the specific skills involved, so conflict resolution or nonverbal coordination, those types of things. And then 4th, we had the performance under duress. This emphasizes the importance of physical and mental fitness, but it didn't explore how these conditions affect competency performance. So the literature tells us what responders need to do, but not what they need to know, be able to do to perform these tasks well. So aside from not having information about the granular competencies needed for these, we also lacked insight into how well these international literature findings actually apply to the Canadian Armed Forces in a flood response context. Okay, so these are the 3 research questions. So first we wanted to understand what effective performance looks like in a military flood response context, what tasks define success. Second, we asked what competencies, so the knowledge, skills, abilities, and other qualities enabled that performance. And third, we looked at how well prepared Army personnel currently are to perform those tasks based on their existing training and experience. So this helped us assess not just what's needed, but also where the current gaps might be. For the methodology, we took a qualitative, grounded theory style. It's best suited to uncover how and why things happen in context. So we had a sample of 15 Canadian Army members. They varied in rank, role, regions, genders, and levels of experience. Each had deployed to at least 1 domestic flood operation between the years 1997 and to 2020. And the demographics were mostly white males, but it wasn't entirely, and so it did actually reflect the composition of the Canadian Armed Forces as a whole. Data collection was semi-structured interview protocols developed based on the gaps in the literature, and we used the critical incident technique approach to engaging the interview participants. So the questions probe both procedural knowledge, how to fix it, and the metacognitive knowledge, or awareness rather, which is things like what PPE, personal protective equipment, to wear and when. And then we did Zoom interviews, which were transcribed by hand, and they were sent back to the participants for verification. We used in vivo for qualitative coding, and we captured first-level codes on individual topics raised, and then they were grouped into higher-level themes. So the rigor checks included inter-rater agreement on the codes between myself and Sharon. We triangulated the themes with literature, the available literature, to validate the alignment, and then participant transcript verification, as I mentioned. And so why did it matter? This method captured real-world details, often missing in conceptual models. It helped build the richer evidence-based competency list, and it feeds the richer competency list, which you're about to see. So this is to answer the first research question: what defines effective performance for a flood responder? On the left is the literature information. On the right, you'll see the data we came up with. So there's a lot of overlap here. You'll see that hazard identification and mitigation came out of the literature, operation of specialized equipment, inter and intra-team coordination, leadership, task force management, and performance under demanding conditions. And then you can see how it contrasted with what we did, which the literature was very thin and it was missing detail. Personal protective equipment was use was barely mentioned, and working conditions, stress was underemphasized. As well as leadership was not singled out as a factor. So our gathered evidence expands and refines the knowledge base, these 5 behavioral dimensions, at the core of this for effective flood response performance model. So for question 2, we're shifting from the criteria into the predictors. So which competencies actually drive those criteria? On the left column, there's the 4 performance criteria again, and this actually carries on to the next slide, but it only provides sketchy competency ideas pulled from conceptual literature and with no empirical backing. On the right column, you'll see our interview data with responders' own list of helpful competencies, and you can see how it's far richer and much more specific. So the key contrasts, you can see, I'm just going to give a couple examples here. For hazard mitigation, the lit review said, know the risks, and our data showed things like safe lifting or PPE selection and working in contaminated water. Equipment operation, the literature review showed us operate specialized tools. Well, we found out that means how do you build a sandbag wall for waterproofing? How do you operate boats and light armored vehicles for operations and evacuations? And how do you stage tools rapidly in a flood environment? For coordination and leadership, the literature looked at communication. So we really added to it the chain of command fluency, conflict de-escalation, interagency radio etiquette, and communicating across different organizations. And then for working under duress, they kind of gave a generic, fitness is required. So we looked at what we got from our interviews was injury prevention conditioning, mental self-regulation, and the ability to be adaptable. So we didn't just map the how. This richer competency set is what enables better training and HR planning for future flood responses. Okay, so for the third research question, this slide shows a side-by-side quote for the fit versus unfit. The purpose is to illustrate uneven confidence for military to flood skill transfer and how it's not automatic. So for example, for heavy equipment and tools, one person that felt fit said, we're trained on heavy tools all the time, it's very familiar. Another person said, operating dozers in waist-deep water were new, none of us felt ready. For sandbagging and basic labor, somebody that felt fit said, sandbagging is basic soldiering, we kept pace easily. For another, they said they felt unfit because boat ops was left to civilians. We lacked the qualifications to operate boats. For physical stamina, there's the forced annual fitness test, so that gave people a lot of confidence in handling 12-hour shifts. But another respondent mentioned, by day 3, my section was exhausted. There was a conditioning gap that showed. And then command and coordination, there was a clear rank structure. There's a clear rank structure, and there's fast local liaison, but also there was some indication of people being unfit because there was a lot of improvised interagency protocols, and sometimes those were confusing. For interpersonal stress management, some people felt fit. They said, the discipline we learned kept us calm with distressed homeowners, versus others saying de-escalating angry residents was harder than patrols, and there's no prior training for this. So confidence exists, but it's patchy. And assuming a one-to-one mapping from general military skills to flood response competencies is inaccurate. Targeted upskilling is required. So for this, the emergent model we have here, this model summarizes the study's core insight. So performance is not luck, it's built on specific knowledge, skills, and abilities. Going from left to right, you can see on the left, it highlights a couple of tangible examples for each competency family. So like procedural knowledge, knowing what PPE to use and when. For skills, communications with civilians, and abilities, fitness and adaptability. When looking at the bottom here, the contextual moderators, so that's things that the best trained soldiers can be hamstrung by something like the late arrival of protective equipment. Or things like political interference, that came up too, especially at the municipal level. And then finally on the right, you can see the performance box. So when competencies and contexts align, responders mitigate hazards, use equipment correctly, coordinate across agencies, and lead effectively, all while cold, wet, and exhausted. So just first up, there was a very small sample size. It was 15. Sharon and I felt we had reached knowledge saturation on the things we just discussed. If with a larger sample, there's a lot more points I think that would have emerged, and it would have been interesting to talk about. So more research could certainly help with the future of this type of, looking into the future of using the military for flood response. But the theoretical implications, so there's a new question, which is, can competencies migrate across domains? There was also the research gap, so what are the fastest, most effective ways to build flood response skills, which we still don't know. And we can't assume that military techniques map one-to-one onto other responder roles. We also didn't have a chance, obviously, to look at different types of hazards. And so that's also another area for future research. But performance gaps signal the need for proactive HR planning and forecast of staffing needs, as well as designing targeted training modules for this. And if the CAF is going to be Canada's go-to for as a major flood response force, they must invest in the competency pipeline now. And if not, these skills will be needed by some other organization that'll take on this surge capacity. And that's it.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Michael and Sharon. This was, again, such a fascinating talk, and I can't wait to read the paper. It's super timely, and it's also at the same time the final talk of this panel. Thanks to all of you, of my fellow panel attendants. Thank you for those fascinating and inspiring talks on the future security challenges related to the climate security nexus. So we have now heard talks about the geopolitical implications of artificial intelligence, about the changing role of climate change within United Nations peacekeeping missions in Africa, about integrating climate action and peace building at COP28. We have heard about the threat, I wouldn't say emerging threat, about the growing threat, indeed, the very serious issue of climate and misinformation. And last but not least, about the competency requirements for army responders to domestic floods here in Canada. Let's join me in another applause for our great presentations.